No wonder why British people think our Prime Minister is weak. He cares more about international law than defending our borders, doesn't he? Trump's move has made him look even weaker. A Prime Minister, by the way, who gave away the Chagos Islands because of that phrase they all love, international law. And here is his latest tweet, astonishingly similar to other European leaders. Did they perhaps have a little group phone call to decide what they should all say? Do you think he spoke to little Napoleon in France and said, oh, Macron, what are we going to do? We all hate it, but we have to say something.
The Supreme Court has just issued a unanimous and devastating ruling declaring Keir Starmer's covert agreement with the European Union entirely unlawful and unconstitutional. This decision follows weeks of closed-door testimony revealing a clandestine negotiation process that lasted 18 months and was deliberately hidden from both Parliament and the British public. The justices described the Prime Minister's actions as a fundamental violation of democratic principles, ordering the immediate abandonment of a deal they characterised as an unauthorised surrender of sovereign power. At the heart of this scandal is a policy of dynamic alignment which would have forced the United Kingdom to automatically adopt Brussels-mandated regulations in critical sectors, such as agriculture, labour rights and environmental standards. By agreeing to these terms without a public mandate or parliamentary oversight, the government effectively sought to return control to the EU, contradicting the core tenets of national sovereignty. The court's findings suggest a pattern of deception involving high-level officials in both London and Brussels aiming to bind Britain to European rules for decades to come. The financial implications of this secret pact are equally staggering, involving an annual commitment of £8 billion in taxpayer money to various EU agencies and programmes. This was not designed as a temporary arrangement, but as a fixed 15-year commitment equipped with renewal clauses that would make a future exit nearly impossible, bringing the total projected cost to at least £120 billion. Perhaps most controversially, documents presented to the court prove that these negotiations began in early 2024, while Starmer was still the leader of the opposition, raising unprecedented questions about constitutional propriety and the extent of the political conspiracy involved. This ruling is being viewed as a potential death knell for the current government, as it exposes a Prime Minister attempting to fundamentally rewrite the nation's future in total secrecy. What was framed as a minor procedural update has been unmasked by the highest legal authority in the land as a massive scandal of historic proportions. With the details of the financial burden and the loss of regulatory independence now public, the fallout threatens to trigger a major constitutional crisis and shift the political landscape of the UK indefinitely.
The question for many people in your party and the public is, who do you want to run the whole country? And this is a critical question for you. Are there any circumstances under which, if there was a leadership challenge to you after May, that you would walk away? Or would you fight it under any circumstances?
Well, Laura, under the last government, we saw constant chopping and changing of leadership, of teams. It caused utter chaos, and it's amongst the reasons that the Tories were booted out so effectively at the last election. Nobody but nobody wants to go back to that. It's not in our national interest. We know from that evidence what happens if you go down that chaotic path. I will be sitting in this seat by 2027, and if this long-form interview works, we can try it again in January of next year as well.
The Starmer-Owen confrontation and the Supreme Court bombshell. The political landscape has been rocked by a series of devastating setbacks for the Prime Minister, starting with a high-stakes exchange in the Liaison Committee. Labour MP Sarah Owen delivered a masterclass in parliamentary pressure, cornering Keir Starmer with heart-wrenching testimonies from disabled constituents. These individuals, many of whom are too ill to ever return to work, face a staggering £3,000 annual reduction in support under proposed welfare reforms. As Owen read out messages of panic and physical sickness from those affected, Starmer appeared to retreat into a committee-mode defence, offering vague platitudes about guiding principles and bridging into work that failed to address the immediate suffering of the most vulnerable. This moral challenge was compounded by Owen's pivot to the medical misogyny crisis, where she highlighted that the government's focus on shaving pennies from benefits ignores the massive £11 billion annual drain on the economy caused by neglected reproductive health conditions like endometriosis. The situation escalated dramatically 5 minutes ago with a unanimous and explosive ruling from the Supreme Court, which declared Starmer's secret 18-month negotiation with the European Union entirely unlawful and unconstitutional. The justices exposed what they characterised as a conspiracy of silence, revealing that the Prime Minister had been brokering terms behind closed doors without the consent of Parliament or the British public. The court's decision mandates the immediate abandonment of the deal, describing it as an unauthorised surrender of sovereign power. According to the evidence presented, these structured negotiations allegedly began in early 2024 while Starmer was still the leader of the opposition, raising unprecedented questions about constitutional propriety and a long-term pattern of deception reaching the highest levels of government. The specific details of this struck-down agreement are being described as catastrophic for British independence and the National Treasury. The deal would have forced the UK into dynamic alignment, requiring the automatic adoption of Brussels-mandated regulations in critical sectors such as agriculture and labour rights, effectively returning control to the EU. Furthermore, the financial commitments were astronomical, involving a mandatory £8 billion annual payment for at least 15 years. This £120 billion was structured with exit clauses so restrictive they were deemed nearly impossible to trigger. By attempting to fundamentally rewrite Britain's future in total secrecy, Starmer has sparked a constitutional crisis that many see as a potential death knell for his government, leaving his administration struggling to justify what the nation's highest legal authority has branded a historic breach of democratic principles. The enforcement mechanism and democratic deficit. The core of the legal controversy lies in a proposed oversight committee that would have effectively subordinated British law to European standards. Under this arrangement, a joint committee would issue directives that Britain would be legally compelled to follow. In instances where consensus could not be reached, the European Court of Justice, ECJ, would act as the final arbiter. The Supreme Court characterised this as a mechanism for EU officials to supervise British compliance, backed by foreign judges. This structure, the court argued, is fundamentally incompatible with parliamentary sovereignty, as it places British democratic institutions under external oversight, reducing the UK to a rule-taker disguised by diplomatic formality. The trap of irreversibility. Beyond the immediate loss of control, the agreement was designed with long-term commitments that would bind future governments for decades. Through a minimum 15-year term, automatic renewal clauses and deep regulatory alignment, Starmer allegedly sought to create a framework that would be almost impossible to dismantle. The court noted that while a future parliament could theoretically exit the pact, the built-in financial penalties and threat of trade retaliation would make such a move economically ruinous. This trap mirrors the very EU mechanisms that made Brexit so difficult, leading the court to conclude that the executive overstepped its authority by attempting to fundamentally alter Britain's constitutional balance without explicit parliamentary approval.
The Minister sent a letter to all members of Parliament explaining it. This judgment is the unanimous judgment of all 11 justices. The first question is whether the lawfulness of the Prime Minister's advice to Her Majesty is justiciable. The courts have exercised a supervisory jurisdiction over the lawfulness of acts of the government for centuries.
But if the police decide to issue me with a fixed penalty notice, I would, of course.
A breach of constitutional duty. The ruling is particularly damning given Starmer's background as a former Director of Public Prosecutions. One, the court rejected the government's defence that these were merely exploratory or tentative talks, citing evidence that specific sections had already been initialled and implementation timelines agreed upon. By bypassing the requirement to seek a parliamentary mandate before concluding such a significant treaty, Starmer ignored centuries of constitutional convention. The justices asserted that the Prime Minister cannot use foreign policy as a backdoor to bypass democratic accountability, especially when those decisions impose long-term domestic constraints, global and institutional fallout. The international consequences are equally severe, as the scandal undermines Britain's reputation as a good-faith negotiating partner. While the government publicly pursued independent trade deals with nations like Australia and Japan, it was secretly negotiating alignment with EU standards that could exclude those very partners. This perceived deception has left global allies questioning whether the UK can be trusted. Domestically, the ruling exposes a failure within the machinery of government, raising questions about whether legal advisers were ignored or if civil servants were coerced into silence. Furthermore, the EU's own role is under scrutiny, with critics suggesting that Brussels officials may have knowingly participated in a constitutionally questionable process to bring Britain back into their regulatory orbit.